It was supposed to be a normal Friday night at Crestwood High, but nothing about that school had been normal for years. Students gossiped about the place being haunted, and rumors swirled around the mysterious disappearance of a teacher decades ago. The upper floors of the school were closed off, too old and too dangerous, they said, but everyone knew it was more than that. Still, no one dared to venture beyond the yellowed caution tape that cordoned off the hallway, not until that night. For some stupid reason, Matt, Jessica, and Nate had decided to hang out at the school after hours. Matt's idea, of course. He always had a knack for pushing boundaries, and tonight he was determined to explore the forbidden upper floor. "Come on, don't be such a wuss," Matt teased, holding his phone's flashlight toward the dark stairwell leading up to the third floor. "Seriously, we could get in trouble," Jessica said, crossing her arms, trying to hide her unease. The dim light flickered across the graffitied walls, the old paint peeling away like dead skin. "Or we could finally prove there's nothing up there," Nate chimed in. He wasn't as eager as Matt, but peer pressure had a way of making him agree to things. Jessica sighed. "Fine. But if we get caught, it's on you." The three of them climbed the stairs, the creaking of the wooden steps echoing unnaturally in the empty building. The higher they went, the colder it got, like the warmth from below couldn't reach the third floor. When they reached the top, they were met with a heavy padlocked gate blocking the entrance. "Great," Jessica muttered, "locked. Let's go back down." But Matt wasn't deterred. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a bobby pin. "Watch and learn." He knelt by the gate, fiddling with the lock while the others kept watch. Within moments, there was a soft click, and the gate swung open with a metallic groan. "Are you seriously a criminal?" Jessica hissed, both impressed and horrified. Matt grinned. "Just resourceful." They stepped into the hallway beyond the gate, and the air changed immediately. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, and every sound seemed muted. The floor was covered in dust, the kind that hadn't been disturbed in years. Their footsteps left faint impressions as they walked down the hall, the sound of their breathing louder than it should have been. "Why do I feel like we're not supposed to be here?" Nate whispered, his voice tight. "Because we aren't," Jessica replied. She glanced around, the beams from their phones casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked lockers and broken ceiling tiles. The hallway stretched on, longer than it should have. They passed room after room, all of them locked, with faded signs on the doors that read, chemistry, history, biology. The scent of mildew and rot filled the air, and the further they went, the more unnerved they became. "Maybe we should turn back," Jessica suggested, her heart racing. "We've come this far," Matt argued. "Let's just check one room." They stopped in front of a classroom door. The sign was so worn they couldn't read it anymore, but the door itself was slightly ajar. Matt nudged it open with his foot, and they stepped inside. The room was dark, the windows covered with grime and dirt. Desks were overturned, and old textbooks were scattered across the floor, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like no one had been there in decades, but there was something else, a sense that someone was there. "Okay, we've seen it. Can we go now?" Jessica's voice was shaky, her hands trembling as she held her phone. Matt walked over to one of the desks, pushing it aside. "There's nothing." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside, like a locker slamming shut. They froze, their hearts skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Matt said, glancing toward the door. "Someone's here." They stood in tense silence, waiting, but nothing else happened. Slowly, Matt crept toward the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, just as it had been before. "Probably just the wind," Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Come on, let's check out the science lab." Jessica grabbed his arm. "No way. Let's get out of here. Something's wrong." But Matt shrugged her off, walking toward the far end of the hallway. Reluctantly, Jessica and Nate followed, the sense of dread growing with every step. The science lab door was locked, but like before, Matt worked his magic on the lock. As the door creaked open, a foul stench hit them, like something rotting, festering. "Oh God, what is that?" Nate gagged, covering his nose. The room was pitch black, but Matt stepped inside, waving his phone around. The beam caught the edge of something shiny, a metal table in the center of the room. But as the light moved, they saw it wasn't empty. A figure lay on the table, motionless. "What the hell is that?" Jessica gasped, her voice cracking. Matt moved closer, his phone shaking in his hand. The figure was covered in a dirty sheet, but it was unmistakably human. He reached out, hesitant, and pulled the sheet back slightly. The face underneath was mummified, its skin stretched tight over bones, the eyes sunken and black. It looked ancient, like it had been there for years. But as Matt stared, the eyes moved. They flicked toward him, hollow and accusing. "Run!" Matt shouted, dropping his phone as he bolted for the door. The others followed, fear exploding in their chests. Behind them, the figure on the table groaned, a low, guttural sound that made their skin crawl. The air around them seemed to thicken, the hallway stretching on forever as they sprinted back toward the stairwell. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy, deliberate, getting closer with every second. "Don't look back!" Nate shouted, but Jessica couldn't help it. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a figure at the end of the hall. It was the same thing they'd seen in the lab, its body twisted and contorted, its dead eyes locked on them. They reached the stairwell, nearly tripping over each other as they scrambled down the steps. The sounds behind them were deafening now, slamming doors, breaking glass, and that awful groaning, as if the very building was waking up. They burst through the front doors of the school, panting, their hearts pounding in their ears. When they finally looked back, the school was silent again, the windows dark and empty. "What the hell was that?" Jessica gasped, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Matt said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But we're never going back there again." As they walked away, none of them noticed the small, dirty window at the top of the school. A shadow stood behind it, watching them leave. Waiting for the next time someone would be brave, or foolish, enough to enter. Willow Creek High was known for its serene setting, surrounded by trees and a winding creek that gave the school its name. It was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, at least, until the day of the lockdown. It started like any other day. The September air was cool, with a breeze drifting through the open windows of the classrooms. Students shuffled in, ready for another uneventful day of lessons. But by fourth period, everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came through the PA system. The principal's voice crackled to life, her usual calm tone replaced with an edge of panic. "Attention all students and staff," she said, "this is not a drill. We are now in lockdown. Please follow all procedures immediately. I repeat, this is not a drill." A wave of confusion spread through Ms. Harper's history class. Students glanced around, unsure if this was some elaborate prank. But when Ms. Harper's face went pale, they knew it was real. "Everyone, get under your desks," Ms. Harper ordered, her voice shaking. Quickly. The classroom erupted into frantic movement. Chairs scraped against the floor as students crouched down, their breath shallow and hearts pounding. Claire, a junior sitting near the back, hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. Lockdowns were rare at Willow Creek. They'd never had a real one before. Ms. Harper locked the door, pulling the blinds down over the windows. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the distant sound of the wind outside. For what felt like hours, no one spoke. They sat in the darkened classroom, waiting. Then, without warning, there was a loud bang from the hallway. Claire's heart jumped into her throat. She glanced toward the door, barely able to see through the small window. Ms. Harper froze, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" whispered Ben, the boy next to Claire. "Shoo," Miss Harper hissed, motioning for them to stay quiet. Another bang echoed through the hall, closer this time. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving down the corridor outside. Each step seemed heavier than the last, like whoever, or whatever, was out there was dragging something behind them. The footsteps stopped right outside their classroom. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The door handle rattled, and she could see the silhouette of someone standing just outside. The figure paused, almost like they were listening, and then moved on. The room was so silent, Claire could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Suddenly, from the next room over, there was a scream. It was short and sharp, cutting through the tense air like a knife. Claire clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide in terror. What was happening? Ms. Harper shot a glance at the clock. It had been over half an hour since the lockdown had started, but it felt like an eternity. The students huddled under their desks, praying for it to be over soon. The footsteps returned, but this time they were louder, closer. They heard the creak of the door next to them being forced open. Another scream followed, this one longer, filled with pure terror. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Claire's stomach turned, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to imagine what was happening in the next room. "We'll be okay," Miss Harper whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. "Just stay quiet." But it wasn't over. Minutes later, the door to their classroom rattled again, harder this time. Whoever was outside was trying to get in. Claire's heart raced as she stared at the door, her entire body trembling. And then, to her horror, the door handle slowly turned. The lock held. But whoever was outside wasn't giving up. They pounded on the door with increasing force, shaking it in its frame. Ms. Harper grabbed a heavy textbook and stood near the door, her face pale but determined. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. The door rattled under the weight of each hit. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Minutes ticked by. The lockdown alarm still blared from the speakers, but everything else was deathly quiet. Claire's hands were shaking uncontrollably as she held her knees tighter to her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the principal's voice returned to the PA system. "All clear. I repeat, all clear. The lockdown is over." Ms. Harper let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her face. "Okay, everyone, stay calm. We're going to leave in an orderly fashion." The students slowly got up, their legs stiff from crouching for so long. Claire stood, her legs trembling beneath her. As they filed out of the classroom, the hallway was eerily empty. The other classrooms remained locked, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The door to the room next to theirs was wide open. And inside, the desks were overturned, chairs scattered across the floor. Blood smeared the walls in long, jagged streaks, and someone, had been dragged from the room, leaving a long, dark trail leading toward the stairwell. Claire felt bile rise in her throat. "What happened?" she whispered, but no one answered. Ms. Harper stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the horrific scene before her. The police arrived minutes later, flooding the halls with flashing lights and frantic shouts. The school was evacuated, and the students were herded outside, dazed and terrified. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more disturbing than the last. But no one could explain what had happened. No one saw who, or what, had been responsible for the lockdown. The police scoured the school, searching for answers. But there were no suspects, no clues. The blood in the classroom didn't match anyone who had been at the school that day. The only thing they found was a single, discarded key lying in the hallway, its surface scratched and worn. And the worst part? The student who had screamed, the one who had been in the room next to Claire's, was gone. Not just missing, but gone. There were no records of them ever attending Willow Creek High. Their name was erased from the roster, their locker emptied, their presents wiped clean as though they had never existed. Claire didn't go back to school after that. She couldn't. The memory of that day haunted her, especially the sound of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking just outside her door. Even now, years later, she wakes up at night, certain she can hear them again, pacing outside her bedroom, just waiting for the right moment to come inside. Cleveland High had always been an ordinary school. It wasn't the best in the district, nor was it the worst, but it had its fair share of strange stories. There was one in particular that stuck with the students more than any other, the tale of the substitute. No one really knew where it started, but the legend went something like this: once a year, a strange substitute teacher would show up unexpectedly. No one would remember hiring him, no one would know his name, and he'd disappear as quickly as he appeared. The next day, someone from that class would be missing, gone without a trace, as if they never existed. Students and teachers would forget the missing student, like they'd been erased from reality. Of course, most students treated the story as a joke, a silly ghost story to scare the freshmen. That was until last fall, when the substitute came back. It started like any other day. The bell rang, and students shuffled into Mr. Henley's chemistry class. Only, Mr. Henley wasn't there. Instead, a tall, thin man in a dark suit stood at the front of the classroom, scribbling something unintelligible on the chalkboard. "Where's Mr. Henley?" a student named Claire asked as she took her seat. The substitute turned slowly, his eyes hidden behind thick, round glasses. His skin was unnaturally pale, and his smile was just a little too wide. "Mr. Henley is unavailable today. I'll be taking over." There was something unsettling about the way he spoke. His voice was smooth, but there was a strange undercurrent to it, like a whisper behind the words. The students exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. After all, substitute teachers came and went all the time, right? "Today's lesson is on chemical reactions," the substitute continued, turning back to the chalkboard. His handwriting was erratic, each letter jagged and wrong, as though he didn't quite understand how to form them. But the students tried to focus, chalking it up to just another weird teacher. As the class progressed, though, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered sporadically, the air grew colder, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder and slower. Claire sat at her desk, twirling her pencil, trying to focus on the lesson. But something felt off. She glanced around the room, and for a moment, everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in, and the faces of her classmates blurred in her peripheral vision. She blinked, and everything snapped back into place, but the unease lingered. Halfway through the class, the substitute stopped writing. He stood still, staring at the chalkboard, his back to the students. The room was deathly silent. "Is he okay?" whispered a girl in the back row. Before anyone could answer, the substitute turned around sharply. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, hidden behind those thick glasses, seemed to bore into each student in turn. "Let's try something different," he said, his voice lower now. "An experiment." He walked to the front row, picking up a small beaker from the desk and holding it out. "Who would like to volunteer?" The room went silent. No one moved. "Come now," the substitute urged, his smile widening. "Don't be shy. It's a simple demonstration." Reluctantly, a boy named James stood up. He was always the class clown, the one who couldn't resist showing off, even if it meant getting into trouble. "Fine, I'll do it," he said, walking to the front. The substitute handed him the beaker, along with a small vial filled with a clear liquid. "Pour this into the beaker, and let's see what happens." James shrugged, pouring the liquid without hesitation. At first, nothing happened. But then, the beaker began to bubble, the liquid inside turning a sickly green. A foul smell filled the air, like rotting eggs, and the temperature in the room dropped further. The substitute watched, his smile never faltering. "Now, hold it steady." James frowned, looking uncomfortable. It's getting kinda hot. The beaker started to glow faintly, the bubbling intensifying. I think it's gonna explode or something, James said, his voice rising with panic. Hold it, the substitute repeated, his voice colder, sharper. James's hands trembled as the beaker shook violently, but before he could set it down, it shattered. A thick, green smoke billowed out, filling the room in an instant. Everyone out! Claire shouted, grabbing her bag and running for the door. The other students followed, coughing and gagging as they stumbled into the hallway. But when they looked back, the classroom was empty. The smoke had cleared almost instantly, and there was no sign of James or the substitute. The desks were neatly arranged, the chalkboard clean. It was as if the last hour had never happened. What the hell? Claire gasped, her heart racing. Where did they go? The students stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. They waited for the bell, hoping someone, anyone, would explain what had just happened. But when the next teacher arrived, there was no mention of James. His desk was empty, his name absent from the attendance sheet. No one remembered him. No one but Claire. Days passed, and every time she tried to bring up James's disappearance, her friends looked at her like she was crazy. Who's James? They'd ask, their faces blank. Frustrated, Claire dug through old yearbooks, searched her phone for pictures, anything to prove that he existed. But there was nothing. It was like he'd been erased from existence. And then, 1 week later, it happened again. Another substitute showed up in a different class, a new face, but the same chilling smile. By the end of the day, another student was gone, and no one seemed to remember them. Claire's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. The substitute wasn't just a ghost story. He was real. He was taking them, one by one, erasing them from the world. And she was the only one who knew. The next morning, Claire walked into school, her stomach in knots. She didn't know how to stop him, but she knew one thing, she had to try, before she was next. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.